unfortunately, I'm going to start with some disappointing news. I'm very sorry to announce this talk is going to have no explosions, no steam, and I don't even have a beautiful British accent. So I hope you've all had a beer or two or three with lunch so that you can tolerate this rather more sedate talk. So, as the introduction said, my name is Coco. I'm an applied mathematician and a writer, and I've just published a book called Optimal Illusions: The False Promise of Optimization. Now, I started with this question: how does a mathematical concept like optimization or efficiency become so embedded in our modern gospel? I'm curious of the audience members, how many work in optimization? Anybody? One or two? And how many are into personal optimization? Diet, exercise. So compared to the American audiences I have, these numbers are much, much lower. I wish we could turn the camera around and then also see the American ones. So I'm happy to hear that these ideas haven't infiltrated Europe so much. But nevertheless, there were some hands. And I grew up and worked much of my career in San Francisco, Silicon Valley, which is one of these centers of optimization. When I was growing up, technology was sort of on the cusp of becoming a big thing. And I then hopped over to another center of optimization at MIT. And when I returned to San Francisco to work in technology, the whole startup mentality of productivity, efficiency was in full swing. And I began to question, as a mathematician who worked in this field and used optimizations and algorithms in my daily work, why were these ideas, why had they infiltrated so much into how we talked and into our personal lives? People talked about optimizing their calendars, optimizing their childcare, eating the optimal nutrition, having the optimal exercise regimen. And despite all this emphasis and despite my own work, I actually had and continue to have a rather complicated relationship with optimization. I rejected certain technologies. I held on to my old dumb phone, the flip phone, for about a decade past the point of embarrassment. I would go to parties, I'd have to look up how to get there in advance because I didn't have the email or the maps on my phone. So it was this contrast between these two worlds that led me to do the research and begin to put together this book, which is the story of a number of people who have in some way contributed to the story of optimization or rebelled against it. And I asked the question, how did we get here? What have we lost? And what comes next? So I invite you to see some snippets today of that story. And if you're interested, perhaps you'll pick up a copy of the book and read more. So my own personal story took a turn about 8 years ago when I was in this, embedded in Silicon Valley. I'd headed a bunch of data science teams. I'd started a data science team at a startup. I'd went through several big acquisitions. And I was having these personal questions. I was holding on to my flip phone. And on a whim, I decided to buy a falling down cabin on a remote island off of the west coast of the United States. It's actually closer to Canada than it is to mainland America. And this is a photo. Not every day is like this. Most are quite rainy, but this is a rather beautiful photo from that region. And I bought this very small falling down cabin and very naively began to try to fix it up. I had no skills. I'd grown up in a city. I'd grown up with engineer parents who were very much optimizers themselves. And so I started to learn, the skills of building and also the skills of what it means to live in a small community and make those connections and exist at this much slower pace of life. And as I did so, and I made many mistakes, my garden failed the first few years. Arguably, it's still failing. I learned that the skills that had put me at these centers of optimization and efficiency weren't the skills that would help in this kind of community. And additionally, I felt this tension between these two worlds, this world of a pace that was maybe many years back in time, and the pace of San Francisco, Silicon Valley, MIT, that was focused on building the future and optimizing algorithms and making everything better, faster, and at scale. And I think this is a tension that we all feel, right? Especially those of us who work in optimization, but really any of us in the West that are affected by it. We feel the pressure to go faster, to do more. And at the same time, we feel exhausted by this. And we see, especially in the last few years of the pandemic, we see the places where optimization is starting to break down. This is a port city. We saw very spectacular examples of supply chains, of cargo ships stuck in canals, and people without the goods that they'd ordered and expected to be there in just a few days, suddenly it would take weeks, or they weren't getting them at all. We saw, especially in the United States, where we're accustomed to very low food prices, we saw food prices go up all of a sudden. We saw gasoline prices go up all of a sudden. And it was shocking. We'd built our society on the assumption that we could always go faster, that we could always have more at ever cheaper prices, and all of a sudden those assumptions cease to hold. So before we get too far in, and I don't know why these aren't showing up so well, so I'll have to read you. They got scrambled, I guess, on the in the communication between the slides and the television. It's very modern art, so I won't take credit for it, but that's the way it is. So it's maybe suboptimal. This is a definition of optimization. It consists of 3 ingredients, and this is sort of both the mathematical definition and the cultural definition. So optimization, we're always optimizing for something, so that's our objective function. We're also doing this optimization with a set of constraints, a set of boundaries or parameters. And then we have a process by which we optimize. So I like to give the example of making lemonade, right? If our objective function is to make the best lemonade in the world, we have to define what that means, right? Is the best lemonade a little bit sweet? Is it very sweet? Does it have, another ingredient in it like strawberry? And then we have our set of constraints or parameters. We might have the price of lemon on one side. We might have consumer taste on another side. We might have the capacity of our lemonade making factory on another. And then with those constraints and that objective function, we have to find a process to optimize. And sometimes that's as simple, if we're making lemonade in our own home, how many lemons do I have? What kind of lemonade do I want? Here's an equation or a recipe to, combine water and sugar and lemons. And sometimes that process involves very large, in examples beyond lemonade, right? It involves large supercomputers and is a dynamic process to always find the best within the set of changing constraints and maybe even a changing objective function. By the way, does anybody know where optimization, the word, comes from? It was actually first, or the English word derives from the French word l'optimisme, which comes from the book Candide by Voltaire, which was a story in which Candide runs around with a set of associates, including a very optimistic professor named Pangloss. And every time something tragic happens to the group, and a number of very tragic things happen. There are earthquakes, there are fires, there are disasters, lives are lost. Professor Pangloss says, well, it's all for the best. We're living in the best of all possible worlds. So that attitude of finding the best, or finding the best in something, I find it interesting that that eventually transitioned into this set of mathematical techniques for optimizing. So, how did we get here? In the book, I trace this story through two lenses. The first is a mathematical or technical lens, and the second is a more social or narrative lens. This is the mathematical lens. There were sort of three techniques that allowed us to optimize and really become a society in which these ideas are possible in supply chains, in our market economics, and everything else. And those three ideas were atomization, abstraction, and automation. So atomization is the splitting into self-same units, right? It's much easier to optimize a factory where everybody's making the same thing than an artisanal process where you might have one person, making sausages in one particular way that they've done in their family for generations, and then their neighbor is making sausages a different way. Abstraction are the techniques of mathematical modeling, or of thinking of things in the abstract rather than as a craftsman in the particular, and blending these things in order to optimize or make things better and faster. I use the example of the shoe company Zappos, which was started in San Francisco, grew in Las Vegas, and was eventually bought by Amazon. And by atomizing the shoes that they provided in this simple web interface, and then abstracting the choice of those shoes, as well as their entire customer service function and delivery functions through these mathematical models, and then further automating those to speed them up and make them as efficient as possible, they were able to be incredibly successful and still are. So another way of telling the story, as I mentioned, is through this narrative or cultural lens. What were the philosophical ideas that got us to the place where optimization is our modern gospel? And this is a drawing of John Stuart Mill, a British philosopher who is largely responsible for the ideas of utilitarianism. Now, what is utilitarianism? It's a philosophy, a 19th century British philosophy that says we, as individuals, we can figure out how to connect our own actions to social good. And therefore, we can maximize social good through our individual actions. And I argue that this is one of the key underlying ideas of optimization. Before then, or before this set of ideas, it was very difficult. Our philosophies were often about being good for intrinsic reasons or for moral reasons, not as a way of perfecting the world. And the utilitarians helped us make that philosophical leap. This is a photo of three, I was going to say American scientists. They weren't originally American, naturalized American scientists, John von Neumann, Richard Feynman, and Stan Ulam. And these three were key scientists on the Manhattan Project in the United States to develop the atomic bomb. And I talk a little bit about that, but really the story I want to tell is about the third man, Stan Ulam, who's a Polish-American scientist. And after the war, he developed a technique called the Monte Carlo technique. And this was a mathematical simulation technique that came to underlie a lot of the technical optimizations that we do today. And he developed this when he was sick with encephalitis and lying in bed, and as a smart man, he was incredibly bored. So he took to playing games of solitaire with cards, and he started wondering, what are the odds, given the cards on the table at a given stage, what are the odds of me winning this game of solitaire? And he actually developed a simulation technique to play out automatically eventually through computers, all of these possibilities in a simulation. And this is one of the key innovations that was perfected by other mathematicians and scientists over time that allowed us to take this idea of how individual action creates the bigger good and actually systematize it. And it underlies a lot of the supply chain and market mechanisms that we see today. And the third person I'm going to mention today, some of you may recognize her, Marie Kondo, and many-time bestseller, the author of The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up. And not everybody may, immediately associate a lifestyle guru with optimization, but my argument is that she's very much in this same philosophical thread. She is helping people tidy and optimize their homes. And moreover, she has helped turn optimization into an almost religious impulse, right? Now John Stuart Mill and the utilitarians said we optimize for a better society, right? Marie Kondo is going even a step further, and she's saying we optimize, it's magical, right? We optimize in order to change our lives. And I think that, especially in America, where we're obsessed with going faster and doing more, that kind of thinking, and there are others, of course, who have promulgated it, has had enormous impact on how we think and see the world and live our lives. So I'm going to talk next briefly about what we've lost as a result of optimization. So everywhere we see the fruits of optimization. We see better medicines, we see a huge diversity of foods and supplies and ideas that have crisscrossed the world at record speeds. And we're able to live richer and longer and arguably better lives because of the techniques of optimization. But we've also lost some things. And those three in brief are slack, place, and scale. So slack is downtime or rest or resiliency. You look at biological systems, and it's the rest that helps them to grow. You look at how evolution works. It's the mistakes or the redundancies that allow species to change and evolve and become resilient. And when you lose slack or downtime, you start to see these breakdowns that I mentioned earlier in supply chains, in the electrical grid. And unfortunately, these things are becoming much more common in our world today. The second thing lost is place or particulars. We see this very often in the United States, and I think increasingly in Europe, where there's this flattening or commodification. Everything starts to look the same, right? And that helps optimization. It's that atomization we talked about earlier. But ultimately, it makes the world a little bit less rich and sadder in some ways when we all speak the same language, have the same stores, have the same products, experience things in much the same way. And the third thing lost is a sense of human scale, right, and connection. And that's what's so cool about events like this, that they help us restore that, especially after a few years of just being remote and on Zoom and not having that connection. But when we start to have these giant grocery stores and we start to have giant corporations and these algorithms that feed us news, right, we lose track of how we got here and what our connection to the whole is. And I do think there's a sadness in that. So I'm going to go briefly through these examples. This is a photo of Lake Mead in the United States. It's the largest reservoir in North America. It was created by damming the Colorado River in the 1930s, and it's not only the water, but also the power that keeps much of the southwestern part of the United States alive, including Los Angeles, Las Vegas, about, 5 different states there, huge agricultural operations as well. And when the people making, or when they dammed the river, the different representatives from the American states had to come together and make laws or rules about who would get how much water. And when they did, so this was kind of an optimization, right? They looked forward to how quickly the reservoir would fill, how many users they were. They projected forward into the future, like how fast they expected these cities to grow. And they allotted this water. And right now, what's been happening in the last 30 years, and especially the last 10, is the water level is going lower and lower and lower. And that's happening because they optimized for a particular point in time, right? And they didn't account for changing climate. They didn't account for unexpected losses in the water. They actually didn't account for evaporation or plants along the riverbed sucking out the water, which is a thing that plants do. So now we have to face this new reality, right? That an optimization we made 100 years ago no longer holds. And we see that over and over in different systems. This is another example. In the United States, we have a number of these airplane graveyards, they're called, or boneyards. And they're airplanes that have been taken out of commission, some of them because they aged out of the fleet, and some of them because we optimized for particular parameters and particular assumptions in air travel, and all of a sudden people stop traveling as much to those places, or they stop traveling at all. And we have these large jumbo jets that are just a few years old and sitting in the desert, will probably never be used again. And it's actually, if you see the aerial photos, it's a fantastic image, but another example of the waste or the losses of optimization. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip these. I have some examples from American agriculture and also the bison, the North American buffalo, which there are efforts to try to restore. And I'm also going to skip the idea of metaphoric breakdown and John Wayne, who's a cowboy movie star, and I will skip straight to the conclusion, which, first of all, this is a photo of Niagara Falls in the United States, which is one of the largest industrial projects and largest optimizations for power and water. And I happened to be there in the early, I was traveling around in the very early pandemic days when everything was on lockdown and nobody, very few people were on the roads. And I happened upon this viewing platform, and when I got there, it was completely empty. And I was looking at this massive, a shrine really to optimization and efficiency in the United States. And then suddenly I realized I wasn't alone, and all these people started trickling off the bus. And these are Mennonites. They're a community in the United States that live very simply. They're like the Amish. They don't use a lot of modern technology. And they dress in traditional clothes. And all of a sudden, here they were to observe this marvel of engineering. And I thought the contrast, especially with the rainbow on top, was quite stark and interesting, and spoke to both the upsides and also some of the people left behind by optimization. So I do want to leave you with one takeaway. It's that optimization itself isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's worth keeping in mind what we've lost, and it's worth being wary of shortcuts. As they say in the computer science world, there's no such thing as a free lunch. So thank you.